All right. Good afternoon to all. Welcome to Seminar 4 of Year 2 of our seminar on Maximos the Confessor. We're still in the first volume of the Ambigua. We're looking at Ambiguum 8, Ambiguum 9, and the first handful of pages of Ambiguum 10. Ambiguum 10 is quite lengthy. But we begin on page 143. That's where our text begins today. And much of the session today will be taken up with me reading from the text, making a few comments, and us holding these ideas for later. There's not a lot of developed thought on my part, as it were. So we're on page 143, but just by way of easing us in. One of the words that really stands out in this these 20-odd pages of Maximus is the word through. Through. We've talked about through as part of the movement of apophasis, but through is important. And in a way, how we move through phrasing to sincerity and integrity. The broad themes of these three ambigua are matter and its end, or matter and its telos, form and inward formation, and also, I think, renewal of our gift, the renewal of our gift. That's a mysterious phrase. In these passages, in these works, I was struck again and again by what we have confronted more than once: Maximus's sense of integrity, his sense of place and belonging, and how he is able to kind of see the situated relatedness of each thing he gathers together, and he holds them in his phrasing, or in his theoria. This is another word that we're going to face today, theoria, which is translated as contemplation in our text. But Maximus's theoria, his vision, it means both vision and partaking of the whole. Theory doesn't just mean vision, it means vision and participation in the vision, what is envisioned. Maximus's theoria is cosmic. It's of a cosmic awe. So each element, each ultimate, he holds with care in his integrity, which means that in Maximus, we sense a certain kind of ease, a certain ease. He seems to be unperturbed. He's walking through scripture, history, spiritual life, gathering, but he's at ease due to he's got a hesychia of soul, a kind of quietness, a stillness of soul, hesychia of soul. From him, we see only response, never reaction. And it's amazing. This is in part due to his discipline of his obedience, obedience is part of discipline, his ascesis of apatheia, which is a word in Greek which means passionlessness. It's a central ascetic term for our tradition. It means to be beyond reaction to all experience. You can respond, but you're beyond reaction. Apatheia, passionlessness, means to realign our fire. Instead of our fire being impassioned and projected onto things with which we then fall into thrall, it is properly aligned, realigned into our hearts, into where the divine is within us. So apatheia. So Maximus is at ease. He's in belonging. In belonging means that energy is flowing smoothly and naturally, right? God is with us in our nature. We have a natural apprehension of God, so to speak. He forms the center of our integrity, and our integrity is beautiful. And this is important, this term natural, the adjective natural, or the term nature, physis, because in these ambigua, Maximus is addressing the struggle of the wayward flesh, as it were, and the struggle of the straying spirit, and the mortal veil in which saints find themselves. All right, turn to page 143, please. Ambiguum 8. Just a few notes about this. The passage from St. Gregory is from his oration on love for the poor. This is 143 near the top. This is St. Gregory of Nazianzen's, his text. For as long as matter carries within itself disorder, as if in a flowing stream. For as long as matter carries within itself disorder, as if in a flowing stream. All right. Now, look about 6 lines down into that first paragraph. I'm going to read 8 or 10 lines and just comment on them briefly. But 6 lines down, beginning with the sentence, after man had been. You see? After man had been brought into being by God, resplendent with the beauty of incorruptibility and immortality, he chose, instead of intellective beauty, instead of noetic beauty, the relative deformity of the material nature, surrounding him, and consequently lost the memory of his soul's exalted dignity. Or rather, he became wholly oblivious of God, who had beautified the soul with divine form. It was thus that man plucked fruit, which, according to the divine decree which wisely directs our salvation, was commensurate with the inclination of his mind, and so drew down on himself not simply the corruption and death of his body, but also the capacity and indeed propensity for all the passions, and not least the instability and disorder of the material substance that surrounded him, along with its facility and susceptibility to suffer change. All right, just a few comments. Like I said, I'm going to read these out and we can meditate on them. Our genesis is into beauty. That's the first thing. Our genesis is into beauty. Our descent is into what he calls relative beauty. Relative beauty. So we move from what is absolute to what is relative. That's the first. The second thing to note, choice, right? Our choice sets the ground for memory and thus for attentiveness, for our horizon. All right. He chose, instead of intellective beauty, the relative deformity, and consequently lost the memory, right? This is a severing, a choice which is a severing. Then that severing turns into obliviousness. When we are oblivious to life, to the beautiful, beautiful form of life which God made us, we become enveloped in our mortal delimitation. We become enveloped in our own chosen compass. We've turned away from life unto what is meant to receive from life, but we have stopped receiving. That's the first passage. Now the second is on 145, just over the page. I'm going to move through these at a pace, I hope not too quickly, but because there's several to look at. 145. Now this is a briefer passage. It's within the top approximate third. We can begin where there's a dash, or because. You see that? Or because, there's a dash about 7 lines down. Or because God created matter in this way from the beginning, according to his foreknowledge. That touches our conversation last time. Foreknowledge, in view of the transgression he had already seen in advance. His aim was that man, through the suffering and hardships inflicted on him by matter, might come to an awareness of himself and his proper dignity, and gladly detach himself, not simply from the body, but from matter as well. All right, 3 points here. God's foreknowing, foreknowledge. God's foreknowing here means his provision, his economia, his dispensation, i.e., God has made room for us, taken our freedom, our free will, into account, right? That's the first thing. The second thing, we're healed by matter. So with limitation, or with boundaries, comes our proper definition, proper dignity. The word proper there means of its own, right? So with delimitation, with boundaries comes definition, proper dignity. Our forgetting is our own self-inflation, our own self-idolatry. In our proper bounds, we are dignified. And the third thing, the word detach, gladly detach himself, not simply from the body, but from matter as well. This does not mean, I don't think, to cease relation with. I think it means to become unconcerned with. You're not concerned with it, right? To be at ease with it. You're not troubled by it. It's there. It's real, right? It belongs. But you're not attached to it. All right. And then just to finish off this ambiguum, page 149, we'll stay on 149 for a few minutes here, but 149, where in the last 4 lines, Maximus has this beautiful, beautiful image. For the alteration and mutability of the body and of external circumstances are for all human beings one and the same thing, a carrying and a being carried along. And the only thing it has that can be called permanent and stable is its impermanence and instability. This image, which I always loved ever since I first read, the carrying and the being carried along. This is human bearing. We have another word which plays like this, human bearing. We bear our lives, our gifts, and we are borne along. Right? This is an image of flowing currents, of confluence, even of synergy, right? Carrying and being carried along. That's the first thing to note there. The second thing is that our state, our stasis, our place here now is, as it were, of a negative relief to God's glory. It can be understood in terms of negative relief to God's glory. The glory, the expanse, and translation of which into our own provides our measure as well. Right? So in our instability and impermanence, we see the negative relief of that to which we are called. All right. Now, Ambiguum 9, same page. I'm going to read the text from Gregory and then the whole thing because it's very short. This is a brief meditation, but I hope interesting. From St. Gregory the Theologian's oration on St. Athanasius. For it has nothing higher, nor will it ever have. For it has nothing higher, nor will it ever have. Now, this is Maximus in prime form here. It seems to me that with these words, our godly-minded teacher frees his student from predicating of God any relationship of comparison or differentiation, or whatever else one wishes to call it. For the experts in these matters say that this particular form of speech is independent of relation and is no different from saying that God is incomparably beyond all things, since it has the force of a transcendent negation. All right. For it has nothing higher, nor will it ever have. It seems to me that with these words, our godly-minded teacher frees his student from predicating of God any relationship of comparison or differentiation, or anything else you wish to call it, right? Anything else that does not see, well, let's get into that. For the experts in these matters, he's showing his reverence, according to what wisdom beyond him. The experts in these matters say that this particular form of speech is independent of relation and is no different from saying that God is incomparably beyond all things, since it has the force of a transcendent negation. All right. Now, first, with St. Gregory's statement, for it is nothing higher, nor will it ever have. This touches the ultimate exaltation of the divine, the ultimate exaltation of the divine. Right? And it's a statement in apophatic phrasing. It's apophatically phrased because the word nothing and the word higher and the temporal sense and the causation of for, none of those laws apply to what that phrase is looking to. So it's an apophatic phrase too. It's figured in terms of space, in terms of place, and in terms of movement, right? In other words, it's figured in aesthetic terms. And so we think, this is my first point, aesthetic terms or tropes form the heart of the apophatic phrase that gives us noetic truth. It's through the aesthetic terms or tropes or emphasis, which form the heart of an apophatic phrase, that we are granted noetic truth. That's the first point. The second point has to do with the first half of what Maximus is writing here. It seems to me that with these words, our godly-minded teacher frees his student from predicating of God any relationship of comparison or differentiation, or whatever else one wishes to call it. All right. So nothing or silence is offered about God. No word can be said about God. So silence is offered about God. But what is of God is phrasable. That apophatic movement, what is of God is phrasable. God is not of another. Everything is of God. And what is of God is phrasable. In other words, as soon as we begin to say God is, we must include necessarily God is more than, and God more than is more than. I.e., one must think apophatically, which means that predication only makes sense through synergy. Predication, the sense of the sentence that follows the subject, God, only makes sense through synergy. Synergy is the relation to God. There's no natural relation to God. We don't relate naturally to God's essence. Rather, God, and this is Ulysses' point, God's ecstatic, his standing outside of him, God's ecstatic condescension draws us into relation beyond ourselves and beyond his own essence, by which measure we would be overwhelmed, as we are now in this flesh and blood. So nothing or silence is offered about God, but what is of God is phrasable. And then in the second half, I'm going to quote Maximus again. For the experts in these matters say that this particular form of speech is independent of relation and is no different from saying that God is incomparably beyond all things, since it has the force of a transcendent negation. Just a couple of things here. He's talking about this particular form of speech is independent of relation. That is of a phrasing beyond category. That's a phrasing beyond category. Form of speech is like phrasing beyond category and identity. It's a flow that draws us into a dance. And as he says earlier, it's a dance of freedom here, this releasing of predication, a dance which plays. Plays is higher than freedom and necessity and obedience and submission. A stance that plays beyond delimitation, beyond mortality, unconcerned to name. Right? That's the second thing. And then the third thing, or the next point anyways, incomparably beyond all things, since it has the force of a transcendent negation. This idea of a force of a transcendent negation is from the letter by Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, which introduces this terminology into the Christian tradition. And he says that every affirmation of the person of Christ carries with it the force of a transcendent negation, right? In other words, every affirmation is blessed, but each affirmation is not all affirmation. It's blessed but it is not all. It's like emphasis. So an affirmation which has the force of a transcendent negation. It's saying yes, but not only, or yes, but yes and. Or in terms we've used, Christ is and Christ is more. Christ is and is more than is more. Okay, that's Ambiguum 9. Now, Ambiguum 10, please. This is a complex work which we will be with for more than 2 sessions. What I am giving here is a kind of play on Maximus's introductory remarks, which then translate into a long series of meditations on scripture. So this is like clearing the ground, I think, for these meditations, which we'll walk into. That's the first thing. The second thing, since this Ambiguum is about the saints who have, as it were, been granted the grace to play, to use language that we've been using this time. Maximus is free to let's say, relate at length what he knows of the most intimate of our movements with the divine, to the broadest of our movements with the divine. So this is also in one remarkable section. We'll end with that and move on then to discussion. But he talks about the different kinds of movements that the person makes in relation to the divine, and it's completely astonishing. All right, 151, please. I'm going to read Gregory's text first. So this is from St. Gregory's oration on St. Athanasius, the same. To whomsoever it has been granted to pass by means of reason and contemplation, or logos and theoria, to pass through matter and this fleshly cloud or veil, whichever it should be called, and attain kinship with God and be mingled with the purest light to the extent that this is possible for human nature, that person is blessed, owing to his ascent from here and his divinization there, which is given by true philosophy and by passing beyond the material dyad on account of the unity perceived in the Trinity. All right. To whomsoever it has been granted to pass by means of reason and contemplation through matter and this fleshy cloud or veil, whichever it should be called, and attain kinship with God and be mingled with the purest light to the extent that this is possible for human nature, that person is blessed, owing to his ascent from here and his divinization there, which is given by true philosophy and by passing beyond the material dyad on account of the unity perceived in the Trinity. All right, a few things here. What I'm interested mostly in this passage from St. Gregory is the movement. So first, we have granted to pass through matter. Granted to pass through matter. This is the blessing of being given form, being given palpability, being given flesh and blood, and yet not ending there, right? Matter's good. The through is not a rejection, remember. And then a few lines down, mingled with the purest light to the extent that this is possible. So to the extent, this movement of to the extent, this is, well, an indication that synergy is in co-labor, right? Synergy is in co-labor, and yet so much depends on one thing, whether we clear room for the divine light. This harkens back to something we were talking about earlier, clearing room for the divine light, right, which attends grace. And then third, in the last 2 lines, by passing beyond the material dyad on account of. So by passing beyond and on account of. The mystery of this passage is in these movements, right? By passing beyond. this I don't have insight about, but I can maybe clarify the form, and we can talk about it later. Someone else will have insight. What he means by true philosophy, which is given by true philosophy, this true seems to be aligned with Christianity or our logos, because he later used the word being and true being is meant to. But I'm not sure what true philosophy means there. The material dyad, I think, would be the tendency to think in terms of material and immaterial. But I'm also open to that. And then the unity perceived in the Trinity. Well, this is beautiful, because he's not talking about the unity that is in the Trinity. We're taught that. That's true. He's talking about perceiving, the unity perceived. And so it's our wherewithal, our own gumption, our own energy that we're bringing. That makes a difference. One could say, given by true philosophy, by passing beyond the material dyad on account of the unity perceived in the Trinity, that one moves through emphasis, the true philosophy of emphasis, passing beyond the material dyad. That is a kind of apophatic movement. We're not rejecting material and immaterial, but we're not staying there. And then on account of the unity perceived in the Trinity, if one perceives that unity, I believe it likely that one can perceive or compass human experience relatively thoroughly. Okay, now, so that remains a mystery. I mean, Gregory is by no means explicated in any of this. Turn to page 153, please. This, like the first section in Ambigua, sets the scene for what's to come. It's a little bit longer. Now, about 8 lines down, beginning to be sure, right on the left margin, it begins to be sure, about 8 lines down. To be sure, it is by means of reason and contemplation, logos and theoria, vision and participation, that every philosophical virtue is created and sustained, and it is also by them that such virtue is manifested in and through the body, though not wholly. For the body cannot contain virtue, which is a form imprinted within it by divine power, but it does have certain traces of it, imparted not for the benefit of virtue, but so that those who are naked of its grace might come to imitate the divine form of life of those who love God, inasmuch as they have cast off the deformity of vice through participation in the beautiful, and so come to be ranked with those who are worthy of God, or so that those who are in need of some help might obtain it from those who are unable to provide it. And when they acquire the disposition, the diathesis, the disposition of the virtuous, which is hidden in the depths of the soul, but manifested through bodily practice, they praise the providence of God, which has become all things in everyone, and through all things is present to all. All right. So it's by means of, through logos and reason. Logos, remember, is that through which our own being is phrased, through the person of Christ, that through which our own being is phrased. Through that through which our own being is phrased, and theoria, which is a kind of total perception and total participation of the person in the divine light. So through that through which our own being is phrased, and through the total perception and participation in the divine light, it's through those that every philosophical virtue is created and sustained. That's the first thing to note. The second thing is that beauty is inwardly formed through participation in to kalon, he who calls out unto us in beauty. Beauty is given to those who seek, even if they aren't sure how to seek, right? Even if they aren't certain or sure-footed, let's say, about their ascetic virtue, right? And then thirdly, this diathesis or disposition of the virtuous, which is hidden in the depths of the soul, but manifested through bodily practice. It's of the soul, a disposition of the soul, but through the body. Right? So all of a sudden, the question of the ascesis, the ascetic question of the body, is not so different from the question of the ascesis of the mind. All of a sudden, the discipline begins to look a little bit more the same. Now, with that in mind, turn to 157, please. Okay. 157. This is 11 lines from the top, 12 lines from the top. It begins, from the bottom, up from the bottom, I'm sorry. It begins in so doing. Now listen to this. This is astonishing. In so doing, that is, in calling practice practical reason, in calling ascesis reason. In so doing, he identified practice as a state of mind. Practice as a state of mind. Think about that. That has nothing contrary to it, for the contemplative man remains firmly fixed among true things, not polemically and agonistically, but rationally and cognitively, and he will not endure to look upon anything else but these truths, owing to the pleasure he takes in them. Practice as a state of mind. Practice as a state of mind. This is to look at our deeds as if they are elements of our disposition. Intellectually and ascetically, or with our mind and with our body, we are striving with the same stance, the same rooted openness, the same being unto. And it's parts of the same coherence of approach, or part of the same use of things. Right? Remember that Maximus talks about misuse as sin. Our use of things is a marriage of our mind and our body, to use that language. That's the first thing. The second thing, when he says remains firmly fixed among true things, this is a staying among true things. Right? Practice the practical life as a steady sense of belonging, of proper placedness and relatedness, right? Of intimate communion with life. Most of all, he talks about the practical life, practice as a state of mind, as being beyond a choice, as in the choice has already been made. Here, we are unable to bear that which has drawn away from the divine. Right? He says, we will not endure to look upon anything else but these truths. We can't bear it. That's what the ascetic life means. And then this is crowned by the idea that the truth, the divine truth, that to which the ascetic life tends and leads, is actually a truth of pleasure. It's a mode of joy. So the ascetic life is geared towards pleasure. Just following that on 157, right? We're going to follow these passages a little bit. Three lines down. They say that those who have not yet attained purity in their relation to matter continue to be occupied with ascetic practices because their judgment of beings is still confused, and they themselves are subject to change since they have not yet relinquished their attachment to changeable things. All right, what's he saying here? Just prior to this, he talks about perfection and virtue. Perfection of virtue means the wholeness of relation, right? Perfection of virtue means, a wholeness of excellence. Perfection and virtue, the wholeness of excellence. And excellence means that one is at one with oneself, at ease in relation, right? One's virtue lends one to be at ease in relation. The confusion which Maximus is talking about here, right? Those who have not attained purity become confused, is when our interest, our being amongst, our being with, turns into a preoccupation or a fixation, and we forget and then neglect the wholeness of relation, right? We are not free in our relation, so we become bound and we become unfree, and we lose the fuller dimension of our relation. Now, the state of our world is change. And this idea of change is correlative to our being in movement and of movement, right? Being as movements. That's where we are in the scheme of things. Genesis, kinesis, stasis, we're movements. So change is a correlative to our being in movements. Discernment here, judgment, remember judgment means discernment as well. Discernment means to perceive the world not on its own terms, right? But in the aspect of the eternal. So not to see the world in terms of its change, but in the aspect of the eternal, of its being in presence, its emphatic being in presence, being in relation to its source, to its ultimate point of reference in Genesis. This is what we discern when our relation becomes pure. All right, and over the page, just following that passage on, this is the top of 159. But those who, on the other hand, those who through the extremity of virtue, establish a close relation to God, and who by coming to understand him, bear the fruit of blessedness, are turned solely to themselves and to God, for they have truly severed the attachment that bound them to material things, and have advanced beyond questions of practice, and have indeed have become total strangers to matter itself, while growing in friendship with God through contemplation, through theoria. So a number of brief glosses here. Through the extremity of virtue. If you read the footnote, then we understand extremity means the fullness, the perfection of virtue, or the furthest reach. It doesn't mean to be imbalanced or ill. So through the extremity of virtue means by means of the extent, the expanse of our well-centered horizon. Through the extremity of virtue, our horizon compasses the extremity of virtue. So by means of the extent or the expanse of our well-centered horizon. And then the phrase, coming to understand him, bear the fruit of blessedness. This is bearing. This is a gift, not a possession. So our blessedness is a gift, not a possession. And then are turned solely to themselves and to God. This idea of turned, this is similar to the notion of tropos. It means an inner directedness, a stance, a being unto. So this turning is, well, everything turns on this turn. Turn solely to themselves and God, for they have truly severed the attachment. Okay, this severing the attachment is unbinding oneself through apatheia. Severing, it's unbinding. It doesn't mean to ruin the relation. It doesn't mean to reject. It means that we are not bound by that. Sever the attachment and have advanced beyond questions of practice. Beyond questions of practice. If practice has become a stance, right? If it's a sure-footedness, then it's not a constant choice. It's not a quandary, right? So the great athlete has advanced beyond questions of sprinting. He does it really, really, really well. Right? It's not a question. It's not a quandary. It's not a choice. So the matter of doing otherwise isn't really on the horizon. And then finally, this matter of strangers and friends, total strangers to matter itself and growing in friendship with God through contemplation. I think this means, to whom are we close? With whom are we intimate? Are we intimate with what God made? Are we intimate with God himself? Okay. Okay, turn to 165, please, for a moment. We're still moving through these. 165, middle of the page, the first full, the beginning of the only beginning of the paragraph. Just a few lines. It was then, by means of this philosophy, which is constituted by reason and contemplation, by logos and theoria, and by which even the nature of the body is necessarily ennobled, that the saints, wounded with longing for God, unerringly drew near to him through the natural manifestations of the divine presence within them, and in a dignified manner they entered into his presence. All right. So by means of this philosophy, by means of through, this is a path, a way, not a recipe or a formula. That's the first thing I want to note. Next, by which even the nature of the body is necessarily ennobled. This philosophy, the body is drawn up into what we understand as thinking. That is our concentration, rapt concentration on God. The body becomes as thinking and is thereby elevated and ennobled. But ennobled here really means its nobility is renewed. It's a renewed nobility, not given nobility in that sense. Then he talks about the saints wounded with longing. Our desire for our Lord is marked by yearning, by seeking. It's not a kind of a cool, logical approach. It's a fire burning for that other fire of which it is a part. Right? But the wounded with longing through the natural manifestations of the divine presence within him. They drew near through the natural manifestations. The saints drew near to the divine by means of the natural movements of presence, the natural movement. This is nature reflecting God, right? And then, and in a dignified manner, they entered into his presence. Well, a dignified manner, the movement of divine presence, the rhythm of divine breath transforms nature unto his own beauty, unto God's own beauty, right? Another way of putting this, the presence of the light of Christ, in the presence of the light of Christ, the phrasing of our being becomes luminous. The phrasing is luminous. Or our words draw forth fire. Our words draw forth fire. They draw from the fire and they draw forth fire. Turn over the page for a minute. Just a few notes on this page. We're winding down. I want to note something at the those 6 lines down in 167. This is a parenthetical remark almost, but it gives us the clue to what Maximos means when he talks about passing through and the veil and material, right? Even if the saints were moved by the sight of beings, they were not primarily moved as we are in a material way to see and know created things in and of themselves, but so that they might more richly praise God. Okay. in a material way, right, means for the sake of what is not the point. For the sake of what is not the point. In a material way, created things in and of themselves, not created things that are for the sake of the divine, right? It's to stop our attentiveness, our appreciation with the first bit of the gift, right? So this is the matter with matter. We think it's all that matters. There's nothing else the matter with matter. All right. And then halfway down this page, and this, it begins with a parenthesis, this latter, or just above that. Maximus is saying that the intellect has both an active and a passive part. And then he launches into this lovely brief meditation on imagination. So he says, the intellect too has both an active and a passive aspect. This latter, the passive aspect, is what they call imagination in animals, by means of which they recognize other animals, human beings, and the places through which they have passed. Those who are wise in these matters say that this constitutes sense perception for them, being the organ that apprehends the images presented to it. All right. So what they call imagination in animals. I'm not sure if that animals is there because Maximus wants to be kind. The intellect has both an active and a passive aspect. The passive is what he calls the imagination. We begin to understand in what he's saying here why many, many early ascetics warned against what they call the imagination, the fantasia, the image producing faculty, or the image apprehending faculty. The organ that apprehends the images presented to it. Right. In animals, this marks known or trodden or established ways. Right. So in animals, this imagination marks known, trodden, or established ways. It's an idea of image as steady certainty. This is familiar. I know what to do. Right. In other words, it is of an inert nature, not synergetic, as in energetic, synergetic work. This is inert. And this passive method of apprehension has no place or no room for comprehension. It is imprinted by experience, but then the lineaments and fissures of experience remain. And if the experience is marked by a lack of certainty, right? The image is one of certainty. Without the image, we have a lack of certainty. Then we linger without a salve. We linger with our fissures. Unless we become active, we draw near, we strive for presence, we renew our efforts in synergy. I think what he's pointing to here is part of what the saints have diagnosed in terms of idle thinking, I-D-L-E, thinking. The imagination, which can deal only with those images it knows and has no room for newness or combination or synergy, right? There's something profound here. We can return to this. At the bottom of 167, it's the paragraph, from their exact understanding, right? From their exact understanding. Now, from their exact understanding of beings, the saints learned that there exist three general modes accessible to human beings, modes by which God created all things. For he endowed us with substance and existence, so that we might have being, well-being, and eternal being. The two extremes, remember the extremes just mean the elements, the furthest. The two extremes, being and eternal being, belong solely to God, who is their author. But the intermediate mode, right? The intermediate mode depends on our inclination and emotion, our inclination and motion. Remember earlier, Maximus says that the fruit with which we are blessed is commensurate with the inclination of our minds. Inclination here is to the mind as movement is to the body. Our inclination and motion, and through it, the extremes are properly said to be what they are. For if the middle term, well-being, were absent, their designation would be meaningless. For the good, i.e. well-being, the good is the middle term, for the good would not be present in their midst. And thus the saints realized that apart from their eternal movement toward God, there was no other way for them to possess and preserve the truth of the extremes, which is assured only when well-being is mixed in the middle of them. I love that. That's all. That's the end of it. Okay. So what do we have here? We return to our familiar three terms: being, well-being, and eternal being, which we also saw in the Philokalia. A few notes. Our model, our tropos, right, is the form of being that was phrased by our logos. The form of being, our personhood, is well-being. That's where our personhood is located. And our Lord gave us our well-being. Our logos gave us our well-being. So that middle part is of Christ, right? And okay, so this middle way, it's a moving way. It means phrasing well our being. And it lies in between being and eternal being, as Maximus says, and thus proves the texture of their being linked, right? It's the texture of true being, or rather being and eternal being, linked in our created personhood. And we give texture to this in our personhood. And the third thing to note, the unity, that there's a unity which demonstrates the integrity. The road of well-being is that of conjoining or coalescing, or the method as synodos, of drawing the roads together as one. Well-being implies being and eternal being, but it is also inwardly formed by being and eternal being. It both implies and is formed by them. So these cannot be thought asunder. Okay. The last thing I'm going to say, just following on to the next passage, also on page 169, we can bring in true being here. It's following directly after that passage. So, which is assured only when well-being is mixed in the middle of them. Having therefore intensified the visual power of the soul by means of reason in accord with nature, and having heard, as it were, reason itself crying out that one must not use natural energies in a manner contrary to nature, since the misuse of natural powers necessarily leads to their destruction. They were taught by the corresponding principle of nature to be carried directly to the cause of nature, so that, whence they received being as such, they might also receive the addition of true being itself. Now, that is beautiful. What's he saying here? It's through reason in accord with nature. In other words, the logos, kata, according to, phusis, nature. The logos, kata, nature. Kata is the opposite of apo, remember, like apophatic, cataphatic. The logos according to nature. Together, they strengthen the soul. Second, to err, to stray here, is to use our natural energies, nature, natural, our bodies, in an unnatural way. Okay. Third, there is a correspondence as truth, but a correspondence in truth too. We learn from nature. If used aright, nature begins to correspond with truth, and integrity emerges. They were taught by the corresponding principle of nature to be carried directly to the cause of nature. So far be it from rejecting the natural world, Maximus is saying it's our way to what we understand to be more than the natural world. There, but more than. It's through, right? And I have an open question. The true being, they might also receive the addition of true being itself. That would seem to me to be eternal being, but I'm not too sure about that. Okay, those are my remarks. Trying to walk through Maximus's dance, gathering, holding, not rejecting, redeeming the natural world in his contemplation of how it can go awry for us. But also, as we know, on page, Ahmed, on page 163, if we can turn to 163, everyone. This is the beginning. It's about a page and a half. Ahmed, if you wouldn't mind reading this aloud, but this is an immensely dense section, and we might begin here. It's about movements, and particularly movements regarding the divine. Maximus seems to, as I said earlier, feel free here to be intimate. He accords it to others' knowledge, but he seems to be speaking intimately here. And I think that the way that he offers a hierarchy of presence to the divine, and I don't mean in terms of importance, but I mean in terms of registers of being, hierarchy, that it plays right into our considerations of the material and so on. Pardon me, Ahmed, would you mind reading? So from the beginning of 163 over to, well, the first full paragraph on 165, which ends with "in mind to the unknowable." Just that whole paragraph.
Sure.
Please. Thank you.
On the manner and number of the soul's movements. For being illumined by grace, the saints realized that the soul has three general movements that converge into one. Movement according to intellect, according to reason, and according to sensation. Of these, the first is simple and inexplicable, since it is the movement of the soul circling around God in a manner beyond knowledge, for the soul does not know God after the manner of beings, owing to God's absolute transcendence of beings. The second is aligned with the cause that gives definition to what is unknown. And when the soul moves naturally in accord with it, it acquires, through intelligent activity, all the natural principles of whatever can be known solely in light of this cause. And these principles give shape to the soul. The third motion is composite, and through it the soul touches what is outside of itself, and, as if from certain symbols, obtains impressions of the principles of visible things. It was the genius of the saints to have ordered their souls in light of these principles, according to the true and infallible mode of movement conforming to nature. And in this manner they passed through the present age of tribulations. Through the medium of reason, they raised up to the level of intellect their power of sensation, possessing the simple spiritual principles of sensible things. By means of a single, simple, and undivided intention of mind, they uniquely united to intellect their reason, possessing the principles of beings. And finally, they offered to God their intellect, purified and freed from its movement around the totality of beings, and refraining even from its own natural activity. Wholly gathered into God in this way, they were deemed worthy to be totally intermingled through the Spirit with the whole of God, and thus were clothed, so far as humanly possible, in the whole image of the heavenly man. And to the extent that they drew to themselves the manifestation of God, to that very same degree, if it be permitted to speak thus, they were drawn to God and united to him. For they say that God and man are paradigms of each other, so that as much as man, enabled by love, has divinized himself for God, To that same extent, God is humanized for man by his love for mankind. And as much as man has manifested God, who is invisible by nature through the virtues, to that same extent, man is wrapped by God in mind to the unknowable.
This is a sustained mystery here. Alma, do you want to begin to respond? I mean, even in form, this is hard, but I want to open it up now and let's begin to talk. We can begin here. He offers what interests one of the things that interests me most here was when he talks about the first two movements of the intellect and of reason are so far beyond me, my conception, that I try to be present to hear what's being said there. The third, in which he begins to talk about, as it were, it's the correlates of his talk of imagination earlier, where imagination was a passive. He here begins to talk about that there's the translation into the aesthetic mode, from the noetic into the ascetic. So we circle around God, we move about God with our sensation, our aesthetic, our form, our body too. So that might be a way in. But Ahmed, do you have what do you say, or opening it up even so?
Well, I'd like to first maybe defer to someone else, just because some of these categories for me, they seem to have a particular relevance to your tradition, like intellect and reason. I sense that they're used here in a way that's not simply intellect, as in just generally intellect, or reason, generally reason.
Indeed.
But that they have a certain, particularly in the context of the three specific motions. So if I may defer for now, just to maybe get someone who's on more solid ground here.
But just to respond to that, these terms are strange, and these concepts of Max, we have to become familiar with them slowly. We dwell with them, but the truth doesn't reside in his terms. The truth resides in his phrasing. So I won't press you. I mean, I don't mean to press you or anything like that, but it's the dance that he makes with these terms which give him his depth. Goa, what do you make of this this moment of profound intimacy that Maximus exhibits here? Intimacy not only with the divine, we might say, I wouldn't want to presume, but intimacy at least with the struggle, the textured struggle of the movements. What, if I may put you on the spot, as it were, what stands out here? What do you hear in this short meditation?
Only that the whole of the saint, as he's describing it, is present to the divine that's unknowable. I don't have, I mean, I spent time with this passage and read and thought about it. I mean, I think it's a remarkable passage. But since we're passing the baton,
Well,
Michael, you have thought a lot about intellect and reason and sensation. And do you hear anything in this which is different from the way these are understood?
Yeah, and I similarly with everyone else feel on slightly uneven ground. I'll take some kind of false confidence from something that David Bentley Hart once mentioned. I think it might have been when he was talking about his translation of the New Testament and how understanding of Greek, classical and even earlier, Homeric Greek can sometimes improve our understanding. I'm not making any kind of assertion of philological confidence here, but the kata nous or the term nous has, of course, a long standing in Greek and in earlier iterations that I don't think are totally entirely lapsed, but probably have undergone changes in the succeeding 800, well, 1400 years. The term nous sometimes can mean mind, self, agency, and this goes back right to Homer when he has Odysseus in one of the rare passages where he actually shares his contemplation of the divine, thinking of how fragile, appropriate in this conversation, how fragile nous can be. And yet this is an interesting gloss because nous is described here, intellect is described here in a way that we tend not to anymore, as something that is simple and inexplicable. And I suppose we should think of it in that way. And so while it's something that's fragile, it's also something that brings us into a greater intimacy with that which is inexplicable. That might be a kind of dicey inference, so I'm not making a kind of logical inference, but I think it is something that brings us because after all, he's describing a movement that in which the soul is circling around God. So
if I can just maybe add something here, which is what Michael just said, it made me think just the definition of the intellect here as simple and inexplicable. And this intellect, so per the passage, it says this intellect, it is the movement of the soul circling around God in a manner beyond knowledge. And then the sentence finishes with owing to God's absolute transcendence of beings, and yet a little bit further down, for the reason, for the movement of reason, it talks about how let me just get it here. That reason it acquires through intelligent activity. And so when I was reading that, I was actually thinking about the Greek translation, thinking, well, in what sense are the root terms for intelligent and intellect? Are they have the same root? And if so,
logos and logos. Yeah.
Okay. Because then that in a way deepens it. It problematizes it a little bit, but deepens it also, because then that intelligent activity, is that also partake of the simple and inexplicable movement of the soul circling around God? And if so, does then the movement of reason See, this is why it's difficult to wade into this passage, because the concepts are because I quite love this notion of the intellect as simple and inexplicable, and as being the movement of the soul circling around something that is absolutely transcendent. But to me, that seems right. But then it's intellect is closer to, partakes more of intuition in this sense. But again, these terms, they're, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew, noesis is the faculty of the intuition. Is it the
Noetic,
noetic?
yeah, and nous, noesis, noetic, yeah.
So, okay.
It's
So
close
then,
to, it's not intuition, but it's of that order.
Yeah. Would that be, again, being ignorant of the Greek here, would then that be closer to what is meant here by the intellect? Is this
The
moving in the
intellect here
direction
is
of the noetic?
nous, yeah. The intellect is nous, reason is logos, and sensation is aesthesis, or the aesthetic. But if I can just and then please continue on it. Are you talking about emphases? Because it strikes me that these aren't concepts that we need to have concrete, like, well, what is the nous doing? And then now what is the reason doing apart from the nous?
Yeah.
But if we think of them as emphases, like, well, okay, if we think of the person in terms of the logos of God, this is how they are seen. If we think of the person in terms of the nous, in terms of the highest stretchings of the intellect, this is how. If we think in terms of sensation, this is how. And if I may, sorry, I'll come back to you one minute, but David, this arcs back to one of the first things you said was, here you hear that the whole of the saint is present. Maximus is distinguishing within that wholeness that you see. Why is he distinguishing? And why is wholeness something that the saints have, but I'm presuming that we are aspiring towards? What causes us to break down that wholeness or neglect that wholeness? That's my question for you, David. But Ahmed, back to you. If we think of them as aspects or emphases, does that change? Because I really like what you're talking about. I think you're and Michael, you two, you're onto something. But instead of thinking, let's define it as this, we look at it in this light, and then in this light. Pardon me, Ahmed. Pardon me, my friend.
I must say, the first time I read this passage, I was not troubled by it, but I found myself in the rhetorical mode again, because it's like this, and then this, and then this, and we're moving through this. But then I think David's comment about apprehending those things as a whole, and that helps a little bit in terms of understanding these three movements together in synergy, as it were.
Integrity too, integral.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, I would rather think of them this way rather than breaking them down one by one. I think that's the trouble I had with this, actually. And as we're talking about it now, yeah, this starts to make much more sense. And there's the sentence that I had a little bit of a trouble with, which is a little bit further down the page.
Go on.
About 9 lines up from through the medium of reason, they raised up to the level of intellect their power of sensation. That part in particular, through the medium of reason. And so again, to me, that's why I like the intelligent activity that is associated with reason seems to partake very deeply of that simple and inexplicable movement of the soul circling around God. And if that's the case, then reason is something far deeper than intelligent activity.
Well, it could be said through the mode of logos. through the mode of the logos. That could have been a translation too, right? They raised up to the level of noetic attentiveness, their power of aesthetic attentiveness. That's how I read it. Through the logos, which has become flesh, which overcomes dualism, they made their aesthesis, their sensation, their perception. They raised that to the same exaltation or the same striving that the intellect. Did you hear that?
Yes.
There? Oh, okay.
Yes. I think the word logos reconciles, your use of the word logos in that way reconciles those things for me.
So this may be tossing something in from left field, but I used to play left field. So
Toss away.
intellect, reason, sensation. I mean, these are all part of us. They're all part of our capacity. So if we think of gospel narratives, when Jesus takes his beloved disciples up the mountain and we have the transfiguration, there is a moment in which the disciples come to the edge of seeing the soul's movement dancing around God. So in this language, that is a moment of the simple presence, the simple intellect. When I mean, you probably, and David probably can do a much better job of this, but when the rich young ruler comes by night to Jesus, he comes out prompted by his reason, prompted by his apprehension of his emptiness. And that can lead one somewhere. There's no guarantees in any of this. And he comes and he seeks in a honest way to speak about what he apprehends in himself, the emptiness. When the woman with the issue of blood, or many others in those narratives, reaches out and grabs the garment, that is out of pure sensation. She, in that moment, from the little bit we can discern from the gospel, enters into the intellect, what he calls the intellect. That is the simple presence. And what I find lovely about this passage is the way in which it is saying, these are all there. They're possible. Our reason and our sensation are gesturing towards the presence. We misunderstand them. We discount them. They can also blind us. But in our nature, in our created nature, these aspects of our being are really forms of yearning. So even when they're misunderstood, or even when they cannot be acted upon, as in the rich young ruler, he finds himself unable. There are still forms of yearning. So when he speaks about the saint here, I don't know. I don't know any saints outside of the four of you. And so that, it's a little unclear and a little muddy for me as a result. But my sense is that I cannot imagine how one can live on the Mount of Transfiguration. But I also know that there are occasions where one finds oneself there. That is, it happens to us. And sometimes it happens to us that little reason within us, our logoi, our logismo, opens. And sometimes sensation becomes a pathway into integrity, into presence. So I don't know, that's left field. What do you make of it, David?
Well, sounds like all of us. I mean, we're all sort of trying to struggle to figure out how this happens. But I do like the idea that it isn't a lockstep where the basement requires you to get to the first floor, and then the first floor you might get to the elevator, and the elevator might take you there. But all of these combined are ways that we reach. So, I mean, I've really appreciated the conversation. I must admit, reading this, and I don't want to change this now, but because it's late and we should just stay focused here. But there are so many other areas in this that I was so interested in discussing. But that I know the great thing about Maximus is we'll be able to come back to it time and time again.
We even stay with this work, David, so there'll be plenty of time to revisit.
Okay.
We stay with Ambiguum 10 for a while, so
Okay, good. Okay.
not to worry, not to worry.
Since we're staying with Ambiguum 10 moving forward, can we maybe take a look at something from Ambiguum 8? Andrew, that is, unless you want,
Of course, no, of
unless
course.
you want to stick with this. This is just something that
No, 10 we're going to
page-
be with a while. Please, Ahmed, please lead us where you will, please.
Okay.
10 will always be with us. It's clearly a very poor text.
It's
are you going,
actually
my
something
friend?
you read, Andrew. It's page 147. And it's near the bottom of 147. And starting from 5 lines up from the bottom, for as long as this lasts, in the quotation.
Yep.
And I'll just read that to the end of the, if you don't mind, I'll read it to the end. Not the end, but to the first line of,
Please.
actually no, I'll read it, I'll need to read it to the end. For as long as this lasts, then we should not be puffed up with pride on account of the inequality that is all around us, but instead we should, in wisdom, try to smooth out the irregularities of nature, which knows no differences of distinctions or honor. And this is the line that really struck me that I wanted to get into. Meeting the needs of others from out of our own abundance.
Hmm.
Perhaps then this present condition of inequality was allowed to prevail in order to manifest the capacity of human reason to prefer virtue above everything else. This idea of meeting the needs of others from out of our own abundance. I don't know about everyone here, but I assume that for a lot of us who do a lot of thinking, and maybe a lot of thinking at very, very intense areas, that we might feel a certain pride, pride of the mind, of perhaps being able to engage with higher concepts and ideas. And reading this line made me think of responsibility, the responsibility of, and this is something actually I associate a lot with what Andrew's doing these days, just this deep engagement with his tradition, and a certain, it's not open to everyone to be able to do this, but when it is given to you to be able to do these things, there's a responsibility that comes with it. And this idea of meeting the needs of others from our own abundance, perhaps it's a way of getting beyond the danger of pride. There's a real danger of pride. And I love this line because it made me think actually of something that came up in the St. Macrina talks, a comment that two comments, one that Steve Bynum had made, and a response by you, David, in part 2. And the comment that Steve Bynum had made, he was lamenting the potential that the tradition, your tradition, was not appropriately, I think, and this is my interpretation of what he said, but it wasn't properly or sufficiently addressing the needs, to use the word of this time, the needs of our times. I think he was very concerned with that. And then I'd like to juxtapose that with something you said on Sunday. You brought up Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. And you brought up Gandhi responding to the journalist who asked him about the Bible. And the Gandhi says, oh, I'd like the English to read the Bible. Do they know about the Bible? And it made me think, for people in the position of a Gandhi or a Nelson Mandela, that is, they are in possession of an abundance by virtue of the position that they're in, to help those who might be perceived as the victors, the worldly victors, those who are in, to use an ugly word, those who are in power, which means nothing in this context. The abundance is with those who are in a position to apprehend the deeper, more profound things. And in that sense, it might be actually the responsibility of, quote unquote, the victims. Quote unquote, because I don't mean, those who suffer so deeply that they can't even get into the position of a to a Gandhi or a Nelson Mandela. But I mean, even, and I don't know Steve very well, but for me, that should be a spur, or it can be a spur to be in that place is for that to be a spur to help with the other, the real other. I mean, the other is not just the victim. The other is the other in every context, in every way. And so, yeah, I just wanted to put that out there because when I read that line, I thought to myself, my God, there's this abundance is given to all of us. No matter what position in life you occupy, its abundance is given to all of us. Or at least it's open to all of us. I don't want to say given, it's open. The abundance is open to all of us if one is able to
But the Gandhi piece, I mean, Gandhi, as you know, really said that the people of the subcontinent, which he was beginning to champion the cause of independence, his sense that the depth of that, as significant as it is, was easier for him to understand than the depth of the mind of the colonist, the imperial mind, and so he found in the Gospels a narrative and there's so many narratives in the Gospel about this, about that abundance and gift in the little places, in the least of these, in the widow's mite. And so he thought maybe the journalist, I mean, there's a certain irony in his statement, but maybe the journalist could help him communicate the Gospels to the British so they could help free themselves from it. It's not very popular to talk about this these days. I had an experience of my own here some years ago, but which may speak to what you're raising here a little bit. I taught a class years ago. I taught it twice. One was one of the best teaching experiences of my life, and the other one was the worst. So it was a class on the religions of the native people of Canada, as it was called at the time. And I've done a little work on this, but not a lot. It wasn't my forte. I didn't have an interest in teaching it. But there were a lot of students registered, like 100. And so they needed somebody, and I was the only one around who they thought might be able to do this. And maybe they thought I would be burned on a pyre as well. So that might be also another use that this event would serve. So there was an older man that came into the class the first day. His name was Roy Redhead. He had done a degree already in Native Studies at Winnipeg, and he was out here, as he said to me, to visit his old man. That is, to visit his elder, who had really helped him with his struggles a lot. It was beautiful to hear. In any case, I talked with him about the second class. I think he came and talked to me, and he said, "Yeah, I'm not registered for the class, but I'd kind of like to stay. I came in to see what the white man was saying. Is it okay if I stay?" And I said, "I'm delighted to have you." And we became friends. Well, a few years later, I had lunch with him on the streets of Winnipeg. At that point, he'd become chief of the Cree at the Hudson Bay. And he'd been telling me about the conditions there and how 80% of the children in that community were in the care of the state. And he talked a little bit about the damage of the policy here in Canada and everything. And I listened as carefully as I could. And then I don't recall what prompted it, but I said, Roy, look at the people walking by us here. Lots of Ukrainians, Winnipeg, lots of other people. Has it ever occurred to you that the settler carries grief? Has it ever occurred to you to think about what the cost is of being a settler? How most of the people in Western Canada have never tended the graves of their ancestors. And what the cost of that is, what the spiritual cost of that is. Roy, you still have your land. I mean, you don't have as much of it as you deserve and all that, but you're the only ones here that are still located largely on your place. And I wonder, I said it tentatively because I hold it tentatively, I wonder if this issue about the relationship of First Peoples to Canada and settlers to them can be in any way repaired or come to a new day. And I hesitated. And then I said, because I knew him pretty well, I said, until you help us with our grief, because we are not at home. And Roy said, aha. Roy saw what I was saying. So what you are pointing to here, the abundance of everyone, is of course particular and distinct. And part of the gift of communion, of the whole point that Maximus is circumambulating, the whole point of actually seeing each other, the whole point of being able to enter into communion is that we receive the gifts of others, which heal our wounds and ours theirs. So I mean, my sense is that you know, and Maximus dealt with a lot of this kind of identity politics stuff, because monasteries are full of it. You know, I say more prayers than you. I mean, it takes different forms, but it's the same damn thing. And it's even difficult to get at because it's all shrouded in virtue and piety. So how to break that open, but so what I think we're called to by this lovely passage that you pointed to is one can be puffed up with pride of all kinds. I mean, I know that one of the dangers of one of the dangers of having too much is the pride in that. One of the dangers of having too little is the pride in that. These things function exactly the same way, wherever you are on the spectrum. I have talked with Steve about this, and we have talked about, white privilege. And certainly somebody like Martin Luther King understood in a pretty deep way that part of what Black Americans bring to the rest of America is the possibility of the rest of America becoming much more itself. I mean, he spoke about that all the time. But that's also true for each of us. At least it seems to me, we become more ourselves when we experience and draw near others, whoever they are. We become more whole, more holy. Is that what does that speak up?
That's beautifully said. It's beautifully said. That's, yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about Martin Luther King as soon as you brought him up. I'm like, you might want to remind Steve that it was Martin Luther King who came up with the fundamental insight during the Vietnam War that it was hurting poor white people as much as it was hurting poor Black people.
Yeah.
That
It's only when that was realized that they do something to bring an end to it. And what they did was convince the state to draft middle-class white men through a lottery. And the moment that happened, aha, then we can bring it to an end.
Speaking of bringing it to an end, I'm sure I'm gonna have to bail. I've got another obligation, but what a rich conversation. Thanks so much, guys.
David, if you have a chance, I'd love to talk with you in the next few days.
Yeah, okay. I'll send you a note.
Or
See
week,
if we can set up a time.
whatever it works. Yeah, it's nothing
Yeah,
urgent.
I'd like it to. Okay,
Just a few
Ciao,
things
David.
I'd love to think about with you.
I did it.
great. Okay,
To see ya.
take care, guys.
Ciao.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Just to we are drawing into final territory. Ahmed and David, I mean, what you're talking about is profound. to well, I don't know, to add maybe, but this idea of out of our own abundance to share. I mean, Ahmed, you're pointing. I was going to ask you, how do you bear up, my friend? You have gifts, but that would be an inquiry which would turn psychological rather than spiritual. So what it makes me think of is if we share out of our abundance, Christ came and his gift to us is life in abundance. So we share out of the abundance of that life which Christ gave to us. Christ's gift is authoritative. So our abundance becomes a simile for authority. And what you were saying earlier, Ahmed, you phrased it so beautifully. I think that one could, as you spoke of abundance, one could speak of authority as well. I think that is true authority. And in terms of the, I mean, I think that's true authority on the whole, but especially in terms of the Christian tradition, it's even easier to make the case that authority means, or authority arises in one who is most deeply drunk of that life meaning which Christ gave us, and out of that abundance gives back. That's what makes one authoritative, not the cleverness of one's mind or the exaltedness of one's position. It's the drinking deeply. And so, David, I loved how you walked around, even just briefly, the scriptures and pointed to those smaller, as it were, moments that Christ points to too, of almost unnoticed bountifulness. But that bounty there, that abundancy there, is authoritative. That's what makes the widow authoritative, and so on and so forth. It strikes me that analogy can be made, and it seems salutary because part of what Maximus is doing, or part of what we can do with Maximus, is renew our sense of authority and what that means to speak with authority. Yeah.
Just as a footnote to that, of course, the word means
Please, yeah.
to author, to call forth new life, to call forth a new word. So it's authority, but it has nothing to do with rule or privilege. It has to do with authoring the new word.
Beautiful.
Is this what you're speaking to?
That's dancing with it, yeah. All right, I'm going to pause the recording.